going to go ahead and get started, and people can still wander in. Before I introduce Tim, I just wanted to let you know about a couple of other things. This is our second to last real adult faith formation for the year. Next week we have a panel of 4 Montview members who have various connections to adopting their own kind of eco-smart technology in their house, whether it's electric cars or solar panels or heat pumps. And so they're going to come and talk about their experience. They'll have their electric cars here in the parking lot that you can go see after this class and ask a lot of questions of what does this, the costs and how convenient it is and things like that. So I think it's going to be a great Sunday. Then the Sunday after that is Ian's last Sunday, and so we're doing what we're calling, instead of the View, it's the Mont View with Ian, and Clover will act as talk show host and interview him, and I think there'll be some questions from the audience and stuff, so you'll want to make sure you come to that. We're also starting our planning for this summer, a book read. Watch the TWAM for more details about that, and then we'll have a robust adult faith formation in the fall, scheduled for the fall as well. So keep watching for that. I'm going to plug one thing that's not a Montview event. My other hat that I wear is I work on the Front Porch newspaper for Northeast Denver, and we are hosting a 3-night, it's a film and discussion series. It's 3 nights back to back, which I know is a big commitment, but I've been told it's a fantastic thing. It's about climate change, and you learn about how serious it is, but then what you can really do. We are calling it moving from anxiety to action, so that you don't just feel powerless or overwhelmed or depressed as so many of us do thinking about climate change. I think Tim might be making us depressed today about climate change, but we'll see. Tim doesn't really need an introduction, but as you all know, he's Clover's husband. He is a scholar and writer, specializes in religion, ecology, and technology, and I think all 3 of those come to play in his talk today. So please welcome Tim Beal.
Thanks, Mary Jo. This is all sweetness and light today. It's all happy, good stuff. I'm super excited about next week, too. I'm looking forward to that. I hope you all will attend that. This has been a great series, and I'm grateful to be part of it and to explore a different side of my own work and my own thinking, less tied to religion in some ways and more around technology in this particular case. And related to my work at my university with students and with colleagues and so on. So I'm excited to do that. It'll be more of I hope I leave enough time. I only finished this, my hair's still wet from showering because I finished this like about 13 or 14 minutes ago and ran over here. I hope it works, for one. It's a Prezi. And I hope that I leave enough time. I'm thinking of this as kind of a setup for reflection and hopefully some conversation about the relationship between technology, ecology, and religion in the Anthropocene, on the horizon of what will be some kind of form of collapse or catastrophe, and what that might mean. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in. I like this image because it's sort of looks like a kind of fractal, rhizomatic, biological, and also the planet, and also like a kind of network in some ways. So a kind of biomimicry in the image there. So just a little bit about the book that is the context for this, and a few of you have heard this way too many times, so I'll go through it quickly. But for those of you who haven't, I published a book about 1.5 years ago called When Time is Short, Finding Our Way in the Anthropocene. I tell my students that you need to have an elevator pitch, at least one, when you've got an idea for a book or a grant or an invention or a TV show or whatever it is, so that if you find yourself in an elevator with the person who could make that happen for you, who could fund it, who could get you connected, who could be your editor, whatever it is, you need to have a pitch that is short enough to be made in the time it takes that you have with that person in the elevator. And so I have 3 elevator pitches, a short one, which is a 3-floor elevator pitch, a shorter one, which is a 2-floor elevator pitch, and a shortest one, which is a 1-floor elevator pitch. So the short 3-floor one is that it's a book about our denial of death or finitude as a species, how religion has contributed to that denial, and how religion could also be a resource for breaking through that denial and finding hope on the horizon of what may be a finite human future. Hope as opposed to optimism. We can talk more about that. The shorter 2-floor elevator pitch is that this is not a book about, this is not another before it's too late book. This is a what if it's already too late book in some sense. Hopefully it's not, and we are all doing what we can so that it's not, but what if it is, and shouldn't we be talking about that too? And then the shortest, which we can talk about if you like, but I won't focus on that here, the 1-floor elevator pitch is that this is about a palliative approach to the human future. So, and I don't mean that as a joke, I take it very seriously, but I hear there's the climate anxiety right there. It brings out a little giggle. 2 key words, and we'll talk about these more as we move into what I really want to focus on today, but the Anthropocene, which is the era, the planetary era that we are, the geological era that we are now in, and it's the first era in which human behavior and action are the primary causes of change within our biosphere. Probably began around the middle of the 20th century. People are still arguing about that, and some are even arguing about whether it should be officially called an era or not, the new geological era or not. But that's the Anthropocene. It's the bed that we have made for ourselves in some sense. Human exceptionalism is this belief, ideology, faith, really, that we humans are somehow exceptional to and accepted from the laws that govern the rest of the living things in this biosphere. It has deep religious roots, and we've talked about those in some of my other conversations with you. The shape of this book moves from reality to grief to hope. I borrow that from my teacher, Walter Brueggemann, who talks about how the prophetic imagination is about this movement from reality to grief to hope, where the prophet tries to confront the empire, in Brueggemann's case, the Solomonic Empire of Israel, to confront the empire's exceptionalism with the reality of what's coming, in that case, exile and Babylon, and then to give voice to the grief that needs to be given voice to in order to get to hope. There is no hope without grief. You have to move through grief to get to real hope as opposed to shallow optimism. So that's the book in a nutshell. I am not a doomer. Don't call me a doomer. You know this word, doomer? People who were doomed, that kind of thing. This was really kind of crushing to me. When the book came out, there was a nice interview with me in Grist, which has become more popular now because their reporters are always on NPR for climate reporting and so forth. And they're very much focused on climate solutions. Had this great conversation with the writer, and I really enjoyed the article. I thought it was a good representation of my work. Whoever wrote the URL, the web address for it, and I hope it wasn't her, because it seemed like we were getting along great. That's it right down there, grist.org, culture, when time is short review, Timothy Beal, climate doomer religion. I hope it was like the IT person or something, but that kind of was crushing. I don't think that I'm a doomer. I really am wanting to talk about hope, but I think that we need to talk about reality, and we need to give voice to grief as well to get there. Post-book reflections, and this is more of what I've talked with you about in the past. The role of religion and religious communities in this context, everything from progressive communities like ours to, post-Christian pagan communities. I'm in conversation with all kinds of different religious communities, prepper communities, that sort of thing. What might be the calling of religious communities on the horizon of climate collapse? Might this be the prophetic and pastoral work of religious communities in the Anthropocene? We can talk more about that. That's not the focus this time, but part of the work there is what I call composting Christianity. That is to say, Nadia Bolz-Weber says, there are two things you can do with inherited tradition. You can cremate or compost. Right? And so I'm not a cremator when it comes to inherited religious tradition. I think we need to compost it. We need to turn it over a little with a spade and see what can grow from it in some sense. And that's a lot of what I have done with regard to biblical traditions and doing some translation work around those, and I have shared some of that with you all in the past. I think we need to estrange ourselves from what we think we know about our scriptures and other traditions in order to rediscover them and realize, in many cases, the kind of very deep and generative religious ecologies that are there, that are sort of buried under modern Western translation history that tries to sort of make them seem less primitive and less indigenously adjacent and that sort of thing. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking more about the role of technology. And we're going to talk more about, some very practical technologies that I believe we should all be working to adopt next week. That is to say, things like climate solutions and the work that GRIST does. I'm very supportive of that and very engaged in that myself. Another thing to keep in mind is that whatever future we are looking at, it's not going to be like in some of the post-apocalyptic TV series that are out there. It's not going to not involve technology. Human society is socio-technical. It always has been. The earliest paleoanthropologists will tell you that in terms of the kinds of technologies that humans were using in the earliest cultural evidence. All society is technological. All technology is sociological. We live in a socio-technical world, and we need to think about a future that is socio-technical. And that doesn't mean technical or technological in any particular way, but we can't pretend like it's going to be, we're back in the woods or something like that. What's that TV series, Naked and Afraid or something? It's not going to be like that. I have a project going that's related to this that I got funding from the Henry Luce Foundation for at Case Western Reserve University. It's called Finite Futures, Imagining Alternative Ways Forward in the Anthropocene. I'll talk more about that when I get into what I really would like to share today around this. So I'm not going to say more about that now. Today, what I'd like to do is basically read with a little visual stimulation. I'm not going to just sit here and read a paper, but I wrote this little piece recently for an organization called PIT-UN. PIT stands for Public Interest Technology. You're going to see this acronym more and more out there. A lot of different companies and organizations now have PIT offices and are bringing people into those. So it's thinking about technology with a public interest, tech for humanity kind of orientation. And this is, the PIT-UN is the Public Interest Technology University Network, and my university is part of that. It's supported by the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C., and they invited me to write a little piece after I'd given a talk for them, and it's called Tech for the Anthropocene, Cultivating Earth Creatureliness. I think that's what this adult ed class is called too, and so what I'd like to do is basically read that and maybe interrupt myself occasionally and talk a little bit, but hopefully leave some time for conversation too, just checking my clock. So I'm going to dive in on that. And these are just the headings in the piece. The Anthropocene and Human Exceptionalism. When I published when time is short, finding our way in the Anthropocene last year, now more than last year, my editor was a little uneasy about including Anthropocene in the subtitle. Coined in 2000 as the name for our new geological era in which human activity has become the primary force of change in our biosphere, the word was still mostly circulating among climate scientists, ecologists, and environmental activists. This would have been late 2021. A year later, after a summer of record-breaking heat, a year later after 2022 summer when I published that, after a summer of record-breaking heat waves, catastrophic wildfires, and devastating weather events, Anthropocene has definitely made it into the cultural mainstream. Indeed, it's an excellent candidate for Word of the Year. The word Anthropocene itself can get in the way of understanding its deeper meaning. On its surface, it seems to reinforce Anthropocentrism, the industrialized West's default worldview that places humans at the center of planetary change. More significantly, it generalizes blame for our environmental emergency on all humankind, when in fact the primary responsibility lies with the modern industrial capitalist practices of extraction. In doing so, Bayo Akomolafe, I strongly recommend you read more from him and watch him on videos. In doing so, Bayo Akomolafe reminds us the term potentially erases legacies of extermination and the ghastly bodies of those that have subsidized the project of modernity. In other words, it gives those responsible a pass. It should come as no surprise, then, that the Anthropocene is also being deployed by corporations and governments to frame a climate crisis, the climate crisis, as a win-win opportunity for both natural ecosystems and human economies. We can beat this and come out even stronger, make money off of it. As important as this recent commitment to climate solutions may be, it is also an expression of our continuing faith in human exceptionalism, the belief that humankind is exceptional to the rest of creation and accepted from the subsistential realities that they must live and die by. This faith tells us that we can science and engineer ourselves out of anything. In the industrialized West, this is our grand narrative, our big story, which we have been telling ourselves and exporting around the world about who we are and our place in creation, really since early modernism, and I write about that in the book. Part 2, what comes after human exceptionalism? But the deeper meaning of the Anthropocene does not reinforce this big story. On the contrary, it interrupts it, knocks the wind out of it. The Anthropocene is an announcement on a planetary scale of the end of the anthropos, that is, of the modern Western big story of godlike human exceptionalism, mastery, and progress. The Anthropocene exposes that story as a prime example of what Ernest Becker called an immortality project, a denial of human finitude, in this case fueled by a delusional faith in infinite growth through extraction. Whether or not it's too late to avoid all-out climate collapse, we need to find meaningful ways forward in the wake of the end of the big story, and perhaps even the end of grand narratives broadly speaking. If that's the case, then what's next? This might be a little hard for you to read, and this is just from a podcast that just came out about a week ago on Nomad, the Nomad podcast. It's an interesting conversation with Tim Nash from there. We don't know yet, but to find out, I believe we must cultivate a sense of what I call earth creatureliness, an ecological understanding of what it means to be human that is rooted in interdependence and inseparability. The inseparability of human and non-human beings in a more than human world, the inseparability of life and death, the inseparability of environmental justice and social justice, and the inseparability of spirituality and impermanence, divinity and earthiness. Earth creatureliness begins not with delusions of godlike transcendence, but with a call to subscendence, to grounding ourselves in the precarious wonder of human spiritual striving within the larger ecological web of subsistence and interdependence. Earth creatureliness is the antidote to human exceptionalism. I just talked about this a minute ago, I'll say a little more now. I'm leading an initiative funded by the Henry Luce Foundation called Finite Futures, Imagining Alternative Ways Forward in the Anthropocene. We are a small community of religionists, technologists, students, and artists exploring relationships between religion, technology, and ecology in order to imagine possibilities for a just and thriving future on the horizon of ecological catastrophe and potential collapse. This is not another before it's too late project. This is a what if it's already too late project. Maybe it isn't, but what if it is? How then shall we live? I really love Joanna Macy's work around this, and I think it's called The Great Work. She talks about this, that there could be this moment of a great turn where before it's too late in her first edition, that we'll turn around, we'll get it right, and we'll start to move in this other direction. And by the second edition, and in conversations with others, she was saying, the great turn might happen in the middle of the great collapse. We might realize and begin to turn after it's already too late in some sense. And she talks about what it means then to collapse well, which I think is really an interesting thing to think about. A central task for us is to interrogate the role of technology in light of a finite human future. How might new and emerging technologies help break through human exceptionalism, interrupt our faith in infinite growth through extraction, and cultivate earth creatureliness? It's the same question I'm asking of religion. And here I'm just asking it of technology. Technology and earth creatureliness. To be sure, technology has often contributed to the denial of our earth creatureliness. It allows us to refuse or ignore our fundamental inseparability from the more than human world. It promises a world without limits on knowledge, pleasure, power, and even life, as individuals and as species, fueling our delusional aspirations to transcend our biological wetware and go on forever. That's a little nod to transhumanism, which often talks about we've got to transcend our biology and keep the code, right? And they think about it in terms of software and hardware or wetware. But is technology necessarily or inherently antithetical to or in conflict with earth creatureliness? Might technology also be a resource for breaking through our denial of mortal precarity, for letting go of our human exceptionalism, and embracing new ways of imagining what it means to be human in a more than human world? Like many, I often feel a profound disconnect between my techie self and my earth creaturely self. The two can seem incommensurable to and incompatible with one another. At the same time, I've come to believe that experimenting with technologies can create deeper ecological connections between humans and the more than human world. It's important to remember that the more than human world includes machines, as well as animals, plants, and other things. We can talk more about that. What are computers made of, if not earthly materials? I like that phrase, more than human world, because it doesn't mean the animal world, it doesn't mean the plant and animal world, it doesn't mean the organic world. It means all of the forms of intelligence and being, including technology, machines, and that sort of thing, as well as root systems and trees and plants and animals and so on. Moving in this direction, I believe, requires us to go beyond familiar problem-solving modes to imagine alternative futures. Problem-solving is essential to addressing our current state, for sure, but it tends to proceed in a linear fashion, from problem to solution to the next problem, and so on, keeping us locked in the paradigm of we can fix everything anthropocentrism. Gathering to imagine alternative futures does not home in on one or two solutions, but rather opens up new horizons of possibility in the face of a crisis that we may not be able to solve for. We need to develop what Adrienne Marie Brown describes as a kind of science-fictional imagination. Highly recommend this book, Emergent Strategy, by Adrienne Marie Brown. She's amazing. It's very much influenced by Octavia Butler's book, Parable of the Sower, which is this, it's really kind of the one of the original sort of inspirations of the movement, now thought of as Afrofuturism, but it's actually set in 2024. So it's she wrote it in the 90s. It's an amazing book, and she has this. The main character is a teenage young black woman named Lauren, who is also, she's the daughter of a Baptist minister, and she's living in this world of total collapse and catastrophe, trying to find a way to lead and find some sort of humane, just way of being for her community. And she's also writing her own sort of scripture all along throughout the book in her diaries. They're all diary entries, and it's called Earthseed. And people are pulling Earthseed out of that book and like treating it almost like scripture. It's really a beautiful, kind of reminds me of process theology for those of you who are familiar with that kind of process of that kind of theology. But at any rate, this book is amazing. Science fiction, she writes, is simply a way to practice the future together. I suspect that is what many of you are up to, practicing futures together, practicing justice together, living into new stories. It is our right and responsibility to create a new world. And at one point she says, I guess she was quoting someone else, but she says, we are in an imagination battle. We are in an imagination battle. Problem solving, engineering, those are all good things, but imagination is a big part of the work we need to be doing in order to imagine alternative ways forward and new possibilities. The power of play. This is the last section, I believe. Yeah. Oops. Yeah. Such imaginative science fictional work at the nexus of humanity, technology, and ecology must be interdisciplinary. This is where trigger warning, I get a little academic here, because it was a little bit of an academic audience that I was writing for, but I know you all are on board with that. Such imaginative science fictional work at the nexus of humanity, technology, and ecology must be interdisciplinary and experimental. We need to bring together, on the one hand, people from the arts and the humanities who want to explore and play with new and emerging technologies to test their limits, experiment, and ask big questions, and on the other hand, researchers and designers from STEM fields who are hungry for more open-ended forms of inquiry and theoretical perspectives from the arts and humanities. With that in mind, and in the spirit of the science-fictional imagination, I suggest we take our initial design cue for cultivating technological earth creatureliness from the late science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin in her essay, Rant About Technology. Technology, she wrote, is the active human interface with the material world. Just try to memorize that. It's such a great way of thinking about technology. It covers everything from a rock hammer to machine learning and AI and robotics. Technology is the active human interface with the material world. It's the means by which we connect our bodies and our senses with the rest of the more than human world around us. I don't know how to build and power a refrigerator or program a computer, but I don't know how to make a fish hook or a pair of shoes either. I love that. I could learn. We all can learn. That's the neat thing about technologies. They're what we can learn to do. And I lost my italics. In other words, we are all technologists. This understanding of technology should be inspiring and empowering for all of us, from data scientists and AI engineers to philosophers and poets, as we reflect on the call to develop ecological technologies of Earth creatureliness. First, it makes clear that technology does not necessarily alienate us from other humans or from the more than human world. And this is a common understanding of technology, that technology basically functions to disconnect us from nature and even to alienate us from one another. And I think a lot of us have some of that understanding, operate with that kind of understanding of technology as a kind of default, but I'm wanting to push against that. On the contrary, it is first and foremost our means of connecting with that world through our embodied senses. As active human interface with the material world, technology connects us with our environment. It is, to borrow from Michael Hemingway's theory of interface, he did his PhD at University of Denver, and I do a lot of work with him. He defines interface as a dynamic space of meeting that creates and is created by the entangled interaction of different entities. In this case, we're talking about the human and the more than human, the human and the material. So technology as interface, picking up on Ursula Le Guin, technology as human interface with the material world. What do we mean by interface? We mean a dynamic space of meaning that creates and is created by the entangled interaction of different entities. That's Michael wearing a HoloLens mixed reality device there, by the way. With this entanglement of relationships, the interface, moreover, technology itself comes alive. It has agency in the network of interconnections and interdependencies that emerges, opening space for new possibilities. This is where some of you might not agree with me. I'm pushing a little bit here. I want us to be thinking about a socio-technical future in which we are in relationship with the more than human world that includes machines and technologies and other kinds of intelligences. Where was I? In this sense, James Bridle, this amazing book, Ways of Being, Animals, Plants, Machines, The Search for Planetary Intelligence, suggests technology actually exemplifies and performs the most central characteristics of ecology: complexity, interrelatedness, interdependence, distribution of control and agency, even a closeness to the earth and sky, on, under, and out of which we fashion our tools. Technology need not be antithetical to ecology. Indeed, it has the potential to play a powerful role in developing a deeper embodied experience of our ecological earth creatureliness. The second inspiration I take from Ursula Le Guin, that quote that we just read, may seem a little bit like a throwaway. I don't think it is. Resisting the tendency to see technologies, especially computational ones, as the exclusive domain of technical experts, Le Guin insists that the neat thing about technologies is they're what we can learn to do. As someone who has lived out my professional life on the humanities side of the university, writing books and articles, I can attest to how intimidating, even paralyzing, new and emerging technologies can seem. But as someone who recently began experimenting with the programming language of Python and doing work in natural language processing, NLP, and machine learning in the context of an interdisciplinary community of generous, open-minded, welcoming fellow colleagues, I can also attest to the transformative power of such new learning. And this is from early on in that process. That we were storybooking using big pieces of paper and crayons, different ways of using technology to do translation in new ways, as opposed to how translation works with print technology. That's Sarah Gridley. She's a poet and was a professor of creative writing at Case Western Reserve University at the time. And that's Eric Pellish. He's now my son-in-law, but he wasn't back then. He was my student, just graduated at that time, and he majored in religious studies and electrical engineering. So he's a great example of someone who's doing that kind of work. And this was when we were early on learning to code. I was just beginning to learn Python. Really fun times. core to this work is creating low hurdle, easy access in other words, spaces where those of us who may be intimidated by such technologies are invited to try, to play, to experiment, and to be comfortable with mistakes and failures along the way. When such spaces are created and shared by artists, humanities, STEM scholars, designers, and developers, all seeking ways for technology as active human interface with the material world to cultivate a deeper sense of Earth creatureliness, surprising new possibilities may emerge. I think that might be my last slide. This is a selfie with a bunch of my students. We have a new program that I'm directing at Case Western Reserve University. Right now it's called Experimental Humanities, but we've done some market research and it's not going to end up being called that because prospective students and their parents are like, I don't know what that means, and does this mean you're just experimenting with this major and you're going to cancel it in the middle of my child's 4 years of college or something like that? We meant more like hands-on, praxis-driven sort of approach to the humanities, engaging technology to sort of reinvent the humanities. But it's probably, what it's going to end up being called is Program for Applied Technology, Humanities, and Science. It's really a program about integrating the arts and humanities with STEM fields through technology, using applied technologies to build things that can connect and integrate arts and humanities perspectives with STEM perspectives and research. And so we're creating a new major. These 9 students, wonderful kids, they received full ride scholarships to be part of this new program for the next 4 years. They're helping us, they're first year students right now, they're helping us actually invent the major and design it and all of that. I think that's a first for Case Western Reserve. It's been a great time. They are also in a course I'm teaching with Michael, who was wearing the lenses earlier in the earlier picture, and talks about interface. The course is called Responsible AI, Cultivating a Just and Sustainable Socio-Technical Future Through Data Citizenship. And they are working on their final group projects right now. But that's about, on the one hand, sort of getting some hands, it's got a mix of students. Some of them are computer scientists and machine learning engineers. They know all of that stuff really well and use it every day. Others are, religion majors who've never once coded anything or whatever. And so part of what we're doing in that class is a lot of kind of hands-on work just to help people get under the hood of AI and machine learning a little bit and understand what it means to train a model, what data sets look like, how to create a data set card to provide more information for data sets, which are often very veiled and mystified by some of these big companies. And then at the same time, while doing that kind of hands-on stuff, to be working on building models of data citizenship, that is to say, models that empower everyone to understand more about this data ecosystem that we're part of, that we're all part of, and empowered to engage with it and participate in it. The shorthand version is, I don't want them to look like those Congress people when they were interviewing the CEO of OpenAI a little while ago, where they clearly had no idea what they were what they meant by data or data sets or machine learning or training or models or any of those things. But to actually think about what does an empowered, just, sustainable community look like around that, and it's all about helping people find access to these things and be empowered so that you can participate in this socio-technical future that we're all going to be part of. So that's that, and really, like I said, I'm just sort of, how are we on time? Doing good. I'm sort of putting this out there as a question. I'm talking about the need to create spaces for these kinds of conversations, for this kind of experimentation. And you might ask, well, what have you done so far? And not all that much. I was actually going to pull up, I have some videos. One just super little simple example of how technology could cultivate Earth creatureliness is a time-lapse camera. I went and I bought one, and I strapped it to this land of ours up in Grand County, and I would just leave it up there for 15 or 20 days, and it takes a picture every 5 minutes, and you look at it, and in a way that we humans, based on our sort of time scale and perception scale, can't see. You're watching every night, the Big Dipper go like this across in the sky, and you're seeing all of these other changes happening, and you watch that and you feel like oh wait, I'm spinning, I'm on this, I'm going 1,000. What did Ian say we're going per mile? The Earth's surface, 1,000 or something like that. But that's just a really simple little thing. But I really want to be in conversations where we're trying to do that kind of work and think about that. I'm very aware that almost everything in AI and machine learning right now is market-driven, is commercial-driven. It focuses on, automation and efficiency, and that's not what this is about. I want to think about inefficient machine learning models and unproductive sorts of technologies that can sort of, create even a kind of difficulty that opens us to the world around us in some ways. And so that's that, and I'll stop there so that we have some time for conversation. Thank you. No. And please remember that even if you have the loudest voice in the world, you have to use the mic, because it won't help anybody who's watching online unless you use the mic.
So just raise your hand and I'll be by with a mic.
Thank you, Tim, for continuing to create this sense of uncomfortableness, I think, in me every time. I mean, I grew up reading How to Save the Earth, right? Recycling, save water, and I find myself still just in this world of wanting to hope that it's not too late, but also realizing, what if it is? And, I think as a country, we come upon these solutions, right? Like if everyone had an EV, if we all had solar panels, that would be the solution. But that just gets back to that human exceptionalism, right? And I don't know, when I read these solutions now in the papers, I have this visceral kind of pushing back against them almost. And it's hard for me to live with, because it's like the way I've aligned my political ideology. I want to jump on board these things, mm-hmm. right? But there's something that says, well, there's if we all drove EV vehicles, there's so many consequences of that no one talks about, right? And it's just, again, this way of, if we just have this one solution, it's going to solve things. So I don't know, I guess I appreciate you for doing this, but as a society, I still think there's some of us that have, I think that's part of what's going on in society, is like we're trying to make up our minds, should we push forward with these anthropological solutions, or do we really need to find a different perspective through religion and ecology? So I don't think that's a question, but it's just, I would be curious how other people kind of live into this duality of wanting to move forward, but is moving forward really the answer? Yeah. So thank you for just continuing to push the conversation.
Thank you, Scott. And I identify with everything you just said. And think about it all the time. I just leased an EV yesterday, and I had this knot in my stomach, what am I do? I don't know. Maybe I should just not have a car. Yeah, right. I know all the cobalt and lithium. Because part of what we're talking about so often with engineering solutions is other kinds of extraction that replace fossil fuel extraction. We're still in this frame and model of growth through extraction. There's a really good book, I'm blanking on the author's name, from either the 80s or the early 90s, called Overshoot, that just sort of does the math on how far beyond sustainable extraction we humans are. And at that point, he did this sort of mathematical equation and argued that, I think it was maybe in the 80s, that we were living on 10 Earths at that time in terms of it would take 10 Earths to do what we were doing then in a sustainable way. So that's a huge thing. I guess what I would say in terms of that conflict, and I'm just speaking personally, is I don't think we have to operate on only one scale or in only one register, I guess is the right word. We can be doing all of those things, and we can also be trying to cultivate this sense of earth creatureliness that does sort of try to cultivate a kind of disposition that sees ourselves as precarious and vulnerable and finite. And I think there's wonder and beauty in that, as well as anxiety. And so I think that we probably all need to be operating on both registers. I love the little book by, I'm blanking on, Elizabeth Ayanna Johnson, I think, All That We Can Save. It's a collection of poetry and creative writing. Adrienne Marie Brown is in there and others, kind of focusing on don't get overwhelmed by the macro, but just what are some things you can do that probably will have some sort of positive effect, but that also are meaningful in themselves in the act of doing them, in the mindful presence of just being there and doing that. And I think that does both of those things both registers at the same time. What was I going to say? There was something else related to that. I've forgotten. Yeah, but I identify with you around that. The other thing that helps me, that has been helping me lately a little bit, is reading more science fiction, especially science fiction by younger writers, what's sometimes called cli-fi, climate fiction, climate science fiction. One that isn't, I find, well, it's called The Ministry for the Future. Kim Stanley Robinson, he's not a young person. It's a really interesting sort of imagining of all kinds of on the one hand, a real catastrophe, a heat wave that kills millions of people in a few days in India that leads to a kind of radical turn. And the Ministry for the Future is created by the UN this is set in the 2040s, that is created to advocate for the rights of future lives. Ministry for the Future. And it's fun because of all of these interesting solutions that are getting sort of worked out and engineered in economics and technology and so forth. I think the ending is way too happy and short, which is interesting. Kind of like the end of the book of Job. You go through all this and then, God restored everything. It's only about 5 pages long after 600 pages, but it's a great, I'm not sure if those are the right numbers, but it's a very interesting book. The others that I'm really enjoying, one series in particular is called the Monk and Robot series, and that's partly because it's thinking about this human machine animal kind of set of interrelationships, and the first one is called A Psalm for the Wild Built, and the second one is called, Becky Chambers is the author, and the second is called A Prayer for the Crown Shy. And basically, Clover is going to get mad. If she's watching right now from up in the mountains at a retreat, she's going to get frustrated with me because I get too into these stories and I tell way too many details, and she almost broke up with me before we started dating because I went way into Dune after watching that in the 1980s for 45 minutes. But anyway, Psalm for the Wild Built is a post-catastrophe world. It's on another moon, on another planet. This very sort of incredibly symbiotic human, more than human world involving technology and religion, sort of almost a utopian, much smaller scale human existence. But what happens is this young monk, Dex, who, it's interesting how many transgender characters there are in these sci-fi fiction, but Dex is transgender, they, them, and is a monk in this religion that's emerged, a tea monk, and goes off into the wilderness, and for the first time since the robots and the humans parted ways, and that was the end of sort of industrial capitalism because all the robots developed consciousness and walked out of the factories and disappeared. They haven't seen each other for generations since then, human generations since then. This is the first time a robot and a human come back together. And the robot, Moscap, is amazing. But it's just all about their relationship and all of these deep philosophical conversations about technology and nature and religion and ecology. So I'd really highly recommend those. Yes?
Professor, I'm going to take you out of your academia for a minute there. And I love your presentation. I love the book. I'm curious to hear from the voice of your students of another generation how they come to terms with that term you don't want to use about doom. And is there sort of a spiritual, emotional side of this process we have to engage first in terms of acknowledging finality, acknowledging the state of where we're at before we can effectively engage in any of the other pieces you're talking about? And how is that happening in the younger generation? And your own story, if you would.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. That's an interesting question because so many of my students are not religious at all, or maybe they have some religious background and left it, but it's a very secular university I'm part of. They have an interest in religion that might coincide, might go alongside rather than sequence one versus the other. That their sort of interests in ecology and science are connected to their religious interests. But the way I would come at that question, I think, is that many of them do not know about the resources that are there in religious traditions for cultivating that kind of, in ecological spirituality or religiosity. And in class, there's often a kind of, excitement in discovering something like Sally McFaig's ecofeminism, which has been around since the 1970s. But it's like, this is Christian? This is Christianity? It doesn't look like what I thought Christianity could be. And they love reading Bayo Akomolafe's work. And Bayo is a sort of ex-evangelical. He grew up in an evangelical home. He doesn't identify with that anymore. He describes himself as a Nigerian sort of trickster, but he also left the academy. He has a PhD, but he didn't stay in the academy, in university, but has a very deep sort of theological understanding as well. So I think creating spaces to discover those sorts of religious resources can be part of this too, in that nexus of religion, technology, ecology. That's a start to the answer, but I will say that it's my students who really pushed me to write a book that was more about what if it's already too late, and it comes from, since birth, kind of exasperation and frustration with all of these promises that never get fulfilled, and before it's too late since the 1980s till now, and seeing every religious and political leader of every stripe fail to come through on that.
Question
Yeah.
back here.
I just had a question about kind of your viewpoint on the solutions that we're creating. Why do climate solutions trend towards further consumption and not reduction?
Yeah.
In my mind, the inclination towards buying more or doing more instead of cutting or scaling back, it feels like just further buying into what got us here in the first place.
Yeah.
And I understand that it might be more palatable of, well, I don't want to scale back, that's uncomfortable, but I can invest more.
Right.
And so I think my question just, is that the only solution going forwards is to invest more in technology and do more, buy more?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question, and it reminds me of what I had thought about responding to Scott about too. I think, we're so deeply embedded in this, what Brueggemann calls the military, technological, industrial complex, but global capitalism, which really is built on this notion of growth through extraction. And anything other than growth is unthinkable. And yet, it's also completely delusional to think that growth can be infinite, right? Except unless you're Bezos or Musk and you're going and trying to find planets or ways to sort of create factories in the sky and turn the planet into a national park for the elite who survive or something like that. But yeah, so we're in this capitalist structure and ideology that has deep religious roots. I talk about that in the book, and it's hard to think outside of that. There's a movement called degrowth that some economists are talking about, and they're not talking about something that's completely outside of, global capitalism, but trying to think about ways to, and I don't know much about it, I'm not an economist, but think about ways to measure success, economic success in terms of degrowth and contraction. And part of what that reminds me of, Scott, when we try to put these things together, on the one hand, solutions, on the other hand, sort of coming to terms with what might be either a finite human future or at least some kind of collapse and contraction and catastrophe, it does come from palliative care. And it's this principle, when time is short, you pay attention to suffering in a different way, and you try to sort out the difference between necessary suffering and unnecessary suffering, right? And then figure out how to live with necessary suffering and do everything we can, solutions-wise, to alleviate unnecessary suffering. And I think we're doing mostly the opposite. So much of our technology and so much of our growth is oriented in consumption, is oriented around avoiding necessary suffering and putting it on others in the process, right? And so there's work to be done around that feels like it needs to involve economists and technologists and all of those. So that's a part of a start to your question. It's such an important question. And it's interesting that all these sci-fi books are set after capitalism has collapsed, right?
We have time for, I think, just one question back here.
Hi, Tim.
Hey.
Thanks so much for your lecture and Q&A. I am curious and I'll frame it in my own research that I work on kind of in the academic field around right relationship and reciprocal nature with, particularly with watersheds and rivers and streams. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that comes out of the kind of indigenous culture and tribal nations that's really coming into the fore. And I'm curious, you didn't have any examples kind of that tribal perspective or indigenous culture. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the questions is kind of, do you see that? And I'm also really curious within your students, is there this idea of, technology is important, but we still have to go out and have that experiential part of being with nature. And it's really interesting talking to some indigenous tribes in Colorado. They are really struggling with their youth being too connected to technology and losing the indigenous ways. So kind of two questions there if you have
at least two. Thanks, Brian. Speaking of being in nature, both Brian and I a few days ago thought we were going to be skiing right now at Winter Park, and Clover said, "You have to teach on Sunday morning." I'm like, "What?" And Brian found out August has confirmation this morning. So, no, great questions. And you're right, I didn't touch on that at all here. I think you know more than I do about questions of translation of indigenous ideas and practices and of scale, right? How you could scale up to sort of the level of need around, for example, agricultural production and so forth that we're talking about here. So that's something that I don't know much about, but I know is an issue. in terms of indigenous religious ecologies and my students, I think it's kind of what you might expect in some ways. We suck and look at these cool indigenous religious ecologies that we kind of idealize. And so we've got some problems around sort of idealizations of these cultures that the elders in those cultures might not, might want to sort of complexify and problematize a little bit. So that's always some work that needs to happen there. When I hear the frustration around devices and that maybe interrupting or getting in the way of indigenous practices and so forth, I think about this idea of the socio-technical again, and I think, yeah, well, that's going to be the future. There's going to be some sort of future that involves, for those communities, their indigenous traditions and technologies, and so dealing with that in a way that's different from, we've just got to get them away from these technologies, always feels like a possibility for us. And then in terms of students and getting connected, I'm totally with you on that. And I mean, back to Jeff's question, that's kind of my kind of experience too, growing up in Alaska and just spending a lot of time in the woods. And for others, it's gardening, and there are lots of ways to make that, to kind of cultivate that. But many of my students, not all, but a lot of my students, the environmental studies majors and environmental engineers, I need to connect a couple of them to you, by the way, Brian. I told them I would. They want to do river stuff. They are, a lot of them, members of the Wilderness Society at Case Western Reserve. I'm the faculty sponsor for that, and they're doing things every weekend, and, you know, I think they get it, those who have that experience, but it's almost like the first time you work in a homeless services organization or a soup kitchen or something, breaking through and doing that once is so important. Once you've done it once, you get comfortable with it and you start going back, and so that's part of the work too.
We have to leave it there because
Okay.
Kate has to get over for the next service. If you have questions still, I'm sure Tim will stay after. Just go up and talk to him. I'll be at the back door with flyers about the 3-day documentary series in May about moving away from climate anxiety. Thank you so much, Tim. As
Thank
always,
you.
it was
Thanks,
great.
Mary Jo. Thanks for the questions.